All right, good day, everyone. Welcome to the latest presentation of DBA Fundamentals. Today we have with us Bob Ward, the man, the myth, the legend when it comes to SQL Server. Today he's going to be presenting on introducing SQL Server 2022. In the top right-hand corner of the screen, you'll note the three leaders of the DBA Fundamentals group, Steve Cantrell, Shane O'Neill, and myself, Kevin Wilkie. If you ever need to reach any of us, the easiest way to do that is on Twitter. To the right of our names, you'll see our Twitter handles. Below that, you'll see the many ways that you can reach the DBA Fundamentals group on social media. First one being the meetup group, where you'll obviously found today's presentation. You can always find any of our future and past presentations through there. On dbafund.org, our main website, you'll note that we have our all of our past presentations, all of our future presentations as well. And if you'd like to reach out to us on there, that's an easy way to do it. Also, you can reach out to us on dbafundtube.com. That's our version of YouTube. It has all of our previous presentations. Speaking of presentations, today's presentation will be available in the next few days. We'll have it out there so you can watch it, review, learn about SQL Server 22 as you feel like. Because I know I'll be rewatching this several times just to see all the goodness. Also, make sure when you're on DBA FunTube to like and subscribe to our channel so that you can see when any of our future presentations get put out there. Below that, you'll note that we have our Twitter handle. It's DBA Fun. Also reach out to us on Slack and on LinkedIn, so where we have all of our glorious ways you can reach out to us on social media. As I said earlier, all sessions are recorded and available usually within 1 to 2 days. Make sure to check us out on dbafundtube.com. And with that, we go to Bob Ward, who this slide doesn't even begin to cover everything he knows and is expert on SQL Server. So with that, I turn it over to Bob.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I need to update that bio. I actually celebrated my 28th anniversary at Microsoft this past October, but maybe I should stop counting, because as you approach 30, maybe you stop counting the years you've been at a company. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, for taking time out of your day. And I thank you to everyone who's watching this on demand, because at some point this will be on YouTube, and I'm sure going to be interested to watch this later to hear more about SQL Server 2022. So let me start off by sharing my screen to make sure everybody can see it. Just give me a shout there if you can see it.
There it is.
Perfect. Let's get right into it. You got to love a group that before the meeting starts, people are asking questions about the technology. I love the excitement and enthusiasm that people are showing and talking about SQL Server 2022. Let's talk about some logistics here before we get into the information. So I am Bob Ward. I'm a principal architect on the Azure Data team. You might see Azure Data. Bob, I thought you were on the SQL Server team. Turns out, I noticed my colleague Ree Merritt is here on the call today as well. We are both part of the Azure Data organization. We work on SQL Server. Somebody asked me recently, Bob, what do you work on at Microsoft? And I said, everything that has the word SQL in it, I think I'm involved in at Microsoft. So you're going to want to get a hand of this deck today, I'm sure, after we're done. Look at this link right here, aka.ms bobwardms. There's a folder in there called SQL Server 2022, and there are PDF versions of these decks. I'm going to explain in a second why it's a PDF version. You're going to have some questions today, too, as part of this call. So what we'll do is we'll pause after a couple of the demos I'm going to do, and I'll ask Kevin and the team to kind of call out some of the common questions or major questions that have been asked. And then at the very end, I hope we'll have some time as well for some additional questions. But guess what? We're just starting this journey. So you're going to hear a lot more information about SQL Server 2022 in the next year. So with that, let's kind of get started. And it's funny, as I presented SQL Server 2019, I found myself talking to customers and clients and places all around the world, probably including this group. And I found myself making a mistake. And that was, I didn't explain to customers what was in previous releases of SQL Server that were now in SQL 19. Well, I'm not going to make that mistake again. Look at this list. There's some pretty powerful capabilities in previous releases of SQL Server. If you're not on these versions, you don't even know about them, right? So just keep in mind a couple things. One, when you upgrade to SQL Server 2022, which I hope you will when it comes out, you get all this stuff here as well. Number two, some of the things that we're going to talk about today are based on things we've done here. And if you're thinking to yourself, why am I even listening today to Bob, except I just want to know about SQL Server 2022? My goal is a couple things. One, I want to educate you as you're heading to the end of this calendar year and doing planning for next year to decide if I'm going to make an upgrade, should I consider and wait for SQL Server 2022? And then what is so powerful here? Is SQL Server still a path for me as an organization? Should I be migrating to Azure? Should I be using both? I think you're going to find that we're starting to blend these worlds a little bit, and you're going to see today some powerful capabilities that SQL Server is connecting to Azure in new and unique ways. So with that, let me start off with answering some questions that I always get since we've launched this. We launched this at the Microsoft Ignite conference in November. I did a presentation at the past summit. You're seeing, quite frankly, literally a repeat of what I did with a few little nuances. And one of the things I didn't really call out as much in the past summit, because I've received some questions since then, is about, why is this a private preview? How do we get access to this thing? So we made this announcement. We called it a private preview for a couple of reasons. Number one, we are launching this product with the intention of shipping it in calendar year 2022, but we wanted to get the announcement out to everybody to understand what we're doing. We could have waited until next year till we did public preview and say, oh, here's the release. Everybody's like, hey, how come you didn't tell me about this last year? So we need to be in private preview where if you want to get involved, you would use EAP sign up, this link right here. And I think I'll repost that there. And you would work directly with our team in the engineering team to give us direct feedback. It's intended for customers who will really spend time on these features, working directly with us and getting us feedback. And we have a private Teams channel, a GitHub repo. Kendall Van Dyke and Remerit are involved in working directly with people in that program. So you got a very hands-on approach from us, but we need people that are in the private preview to work directly with us. Now, when are you going to ship this thing, Bob? Well, tongue in cheek, we won't miss the name or I won't have a job. So we will launch a public preview in next calendar year, and the product will also become generally available next calendar year. We are not ready at this point to list those dates. You will learn a lot more about that next year. And I have to tell you, I already have lined up a lot of events, some in person, to talk more about SQL Server 2022, and you'll hear more from me and the rest of the team next year about it. So with that in mind, let's keep this in mind as you're hearing this information today. You're going to see a feature. You're going to I got 7 million questions. And we may not be able to answer those today because we're in private preview. You're going to see me demonstrate something, wondering, well, how do I get out, download, and demonstrate that? Well, that'll be when you come into public preview. Of course, if you join the private preview program, you could go and work with us directly. So I realize that's frustrating to a lot of folks, but that's where we are to make sure we give a big quality release to you to launch next year. But I think you'll be excited today to hear, if you've not heard the message, about what's going to be in this release. So in SQL 2019, I built what's called a camera slide. A camera slide was a quadrant of features in SQL Server 19. And I call it a camera slide because as soon as I put it up there, I was in these events and everybody would take a photo of it, right? Here's the capabilities to take a photo of. Well, I call this one now my Wheel of Power. That's my new name, Wheel of Power. So what I'm going to describe is the major categories of features in SQL Server 2022. And then we're going to spend time talking about them. In some areas, we're going to dive deeper. In some areas, we won't spend as much time. It all starts with being cloud connected. We are enabling SQL Server 2022 to be connected to Azure in new and powerful ways that you've never seen before. Doesn't mean you have to be connected to Azure to run SQL Server 2022. We're just giving you options now. And I think you're going to be excited to see what those features look like. Second, we have been innovating, as you saw in my previous slide, a lot in built-in query intelligence, both in the query store and intelligent query processing. Those are major capabilities we're putting to release. Excited to show you those examples, even a good demonstration there. Third, if we don't innovate on the meat and potatoes of SQL Server, security, scalability, and availability, we don't have an engine. We don't have a product. We don't even have an Azure product. So you will hear me talk today about what are we doing in this space. And it's just a tip of the iceberg of a lot of work we're spending here, a lot of things combined together that make the innovation in the engine, which we consider industry proven, to be successful for SQL Server. And I think you'll like to see a lot of them based on your feedback to us. Third, we're continuing the tradition of data virtualization and in something new called object storage. We'll talk briefly about that at the end of today's presentation. And then finally, we want to keep extending the T-SQL language. We want to keep making sure that we're keeping the T-SQL language up to date, because that's the language that you know and love and the skills you have that you don't want to lose. So we'll talk a little bit at the end of the presentation about that as well. So this is the wheel of power. These are the major capabilities that we're doing. And you're going to see me spend more time on the ones to the right over here today, because these are the ones that are probably going to have the biggest impact to you in your organization and in your application. So let's start with cloud connected. And what I'm going to do is present these topics from a challenge solution scenario. So you're going to see a challenge that customers have told us they're facing, told me, and a solution maybe that might help you if you're in that situation. So it can be difficult to set up and maintain a DR site. I remember presenting this slide to somebody at a recent event, and they said, Bob, not only is it difficult to set up and maintain, but it's difficult when somebody else sets it up and they leave the company and I don't know what to do anymore. So what I would like is the ability to have a solution where the DR site is managed. So what is a managed SQL for us today? Well, it's Azure SQL Managed Instance. So what we're going to do with SQL Server 2022 is allow you to set up a disaster recovery site for SQL Server with Azure SQL Managed Instance. We're going to make it easy to deploy, easy to configure. You're going to be able to use Azure SQL Managed Instance for read scale while you're replicating data. And we're going to take advantage of built-in SQL capabilities, specifically distributed availability groups, without you having to set up a distributed availability group and maintain it. And you're going to be able to restore a database that you've replicated into Azure SQL Managed Instance back to SQL Server 2022, and even fail back to SQL Server 2022 should a problem arise that you need to fail over to Azure SQL as your DR site, and when you're ready, fail back to SQL 2022. So I have a demonstration to show you what this looks like. In this demonstration, I will not show you the fail back capability, but in your head, keep in mind that that's the intention and that's what's going to be part of the release. What we've built here is a demonstration that's recorded because of time considerations, but I'll pause a little bit along the way to show you what we're doing. So let's take a look at it. Okay, so I have here a SQL Server 2022 instance and also a connection to a deployed managed instance I already have. And I have the wide world importers database as an example. Now I'm showing you that this is my primary, my read-write primary, and I've added a new table for email registration to this database. So what I'm going to show you is when I set this up and I attach these together, this data is going to be replicated and seeded into managed instance. So there's a new experience in Management Studio. This is a preview experience, so it may not look exactly like this in the end, but only with SQL 2022 will it show up. Now notice when I attach this, let me pause for a second. What you missed, what I didn't show you, was the registration process. So there's a screen that comes up, asks you to put your Azure account in, and maybe you've done a backup to URL and you've seen this. You put your Azure account in, you pick your managed instance, you say, I want to attach this to a managed instance, seed the database for me, that happens. And then notice here in Management Studio, you can see behind the scenes, an AG and a distributed AG are built for you. You don't have to have one. We just do it for you automatically. If you did have one, we would just attach and use that as well. So as I move forward, I should be able to connect into this managed instance and see this data as seeded. So to do that, I'll just look at the portal. This is my managed instance in the Azure portal. And as I scroll along here, I'm just using a business critical tier right here for managed instance. And I can see below down in the portal, I've got a database for wide world importers. Now let's connect an SSMS to see it. See, here's my database. It's already seeded in here. So I should expect in this right-hand window to connect to that managed instance and see that it's read-only now. It's a read-only database because I'm replicating to it just like a DAG would be. And I see my registered emails. So just to show a simple change that's getting replicated, I'm going to insert a row here on the left-hand side to SQL Server. And then over here on the right-hand side, I should be able to run the same query and see the new row showing up. Now, let's say for a disaster, you got to fail over now. So what I'm going to show you in Management Studio is what would I do? What would that look like? And remember, this is a distributed availability group. Let me pause for a second and talk about this. If you know about a DAG today, it's asynchronous. And it has to be because it would slow down transactions. Same thing here. So I'm going to show you a preview of a wizard you would use to fail over. And it's going to be a planned failover. So I'm going to fail over to managed instance, but I'm going to wait to see if data can get synchronized to make sure I don't lose any data. So let's keep going forward and see what that looks like. So I'm showing a little bit of a preview of the, oh, I'm using Anna Hoffman's account. Anna will be happy that I'm actually leveraging her Azure account to do this. So I'm signed in. I'm logging into the managed instance itself, and I connect in there. Now I can say I want a planned manual failover, and I'm confirming that my workload is not happening anymore in my primary. I need to make it quiescent. So in this current preview experience, we kind of wait to make sure things get synchronized. We do a few retry attempts. And once we believe it's synchronized by looking at log sequence numbers, we can proceed with the failover. Once this is done, what I would expect to do is go over to managed instance and be able to insert a new row because it's now the primary, right? I failed over. That's my new site, my new primary. So then when I execute again, I see this new row. Now, what I'd like to be able to do in this example, because I'm not prepared to show you the fail back scenario, is just take a backup in managed instance and restore it and see that new row in SQL Server 2022. This is the first time ever we're allowing you to take a backup from a platform as a service database in Azure and restore it back to SQL Server. So I'm doing just a backup to URL in this example here. And then I'm going to go back over to SQL Server, and I'm going to see, I used a new database name in this case. I'm going to restore it. I'm going to go back to the SQL Server, assuming SQL Server is back up and running, or it could be a different SQL Server 2022 instance for dev test purposes. And I'll restore it to a new name, but I expect to see that new row I added because I added it in my primary replica. So I go over here and I refresh the screen, and now you can see I've got this new database. I should be able to go into it now and query and see this new row. And there you have it. So what did I show you? I showed you an easy preview experience again with SSMS to attach to a managed instance I've deployed. I seeded my database like you would do for a DAG, right? I made a change that was reflected in managed instance. I was able to read only from that, like a read scenario. I was able to fail over to it and make it my primary. And then I was able to restore a database from it to another SQL Server for dev test purposes. What you will see as we move through the release is the ability to fail back to your SQL Server when it's actually back up and running. So that's the experience. That's the promise of giving you a managed disaster recovery experience for Azure SQL Managed Instance with SQL Server 2022. Okay. Let's go over here and move to the next screen. Let me stop, though, as I promised, after demos to see if any questions, because there's been a lot of questions about this feature. Kevin, team, what kind of questions do we have about this specific one or anything major I should address?
So far, it's mostly for SSMS. Can you, if you're connected to SQL Server 2022, that's the only time you'll see those new features, right?
So technically, no. So what I didn't show you is we plan to introduce this same type of functionality in a different way for older versions of SQL Server. What I mean by is this is called the link feature for managed instance. And so what we're going to do and what we announced is for older versions of SQL Server, you will be able to use a similar experience with Management Studio to migrate from SQL Server, say 19, 17, 16 into managed instance. It won't be a failover concept. It'll just be more a migration scenario. So you can go read. We've got a nice blog about this from our managed instance team, where we talk about the link feature for older versions of SQL. It's a migration mechanism, and for SQL Server 2022, it will become a disaster recovery mechanism.
Awesome. That's the only question we had so far.
Okay. So let's talk about a second scenario for cloud connectivity. What's the challenge? Well, I kind of like this Azure Synapse thing. I need a data warehouse. I need analytics. But to copy data from SQL Server, I have to build fairly expensive ETL jobs. The data could be out of date. Like I only synchronize once a day or even longer. And maybe in some cases, I'm even trying to use SQL Server for analytics and could affect my operational workload, or even my ETL does this. So what's the solution to do this? How do I tie SQL Server and Synapse in a new way? And this is what it looks like. So with SQL Server 2022, we're now going to give you the capability to take changes from tables you tell us. We'll read and we'll harvest a transaction log. And this is not change data capture. This is not replication. This is not availability group. It can't be because Synapse doesn't understand availability groups, right? This is us inside the engine of SQL 2022, harvesting transaction log changes, feeding them into what's called a landing zone you don't see here, which is like Azure Storage, in a format that Synapse understands. So what we do in Synapse is we take this data and we put it in dedicated SQL pools in the Synapse warehouse in an automated way. You set it up, you say, these are the tables I want to synchronize, we seed those tables, and then anytime you make changes in SQL Server, we automatically feed those changes into Synapse SQL pools. This is really, really lucrative now because you now then can use the power of Synapse. Instead of waiting for data to be synchronized every day, you can do near real-time analytics. You could, for example, do Power BI reports on top of it. You could combine data in SQL pools with Azure Data Lake storage for IoT data and put machine learning models or even use Spark pools on top of the data. You can now harvest the power of Synapse with changes from SQL Server in an automated near real-time fashion. Now, you're going to want to see this in action. So I don't have a demo today for you, but at the end of today's presentation, I have a link to a mechanics video, a SQL Server presentation I did with the Microsoft mechanics team. Really interesting animation and visualization to show you the power of this. You're going to see, again, a lot more about this one coming up soon. But if you want to see a demonstration of it, I've got a link at the end for a SQL mechanics video to see it in action. A lot of excitement about this one as well. People love the power of Synapse. They think it's a great technology for analytics, but they struggle to get their data from SQL Server into it. They want to integrate it. And this is a way for us to do that for you in an automated, easy way and see it in near real time. So the third piece of the puzzle for cloud connectivity is security. And so what we're announcing as part of SQL Server 2022 is the ability to do Azure Active Directory authentication directly from SQL Server. If you've never seen this technology before, this could be very lucrative for you to support things like multi-factor authentication. We really believe it's going to be very powerful, especially for customers in Azure Virtual Machine. You can now deploy SQL Server in Azure Virtual Machine and start doing non-SQL authentication like Kerberos authentication without using a domain. So that's coming for SQL Server 2022. We'll talk about Purview in a second, our new governance technology. But Microsoft Defender for SQL, what used to be called Azure Defender, has been around for a little bit, and we plan to fully support that for SQL Server 2022, giving you vulnerability assessments and advanced threat protection. And the beauty of this technology is this: the rules for these apply across all SQL assets. Imagine now having a Microsoft system, a Microsoft service that is constantly looking for vulnerabilities and advanced threats against your system across everything called SQL. Azure SQL Database, Managed Instance, SQL VM, SQL Server 2022. Anything that's called SQL, we will apply these services to. So that's coming also for SQL Server 2022. What about this Purview thing? You may have heard of it, but not sure what it is. Well, the challenge is this. I would like central visibility and governance across all of my SQL assets. I don't want to have to go to each SQL Server instance or even every SQL type and do this. Azure Purview can give you that. Today, we've already announced, even with older versions of SQL, a couple of things. Scan SQL servers to look at metadata and even do data classifications with this metadata. We've even announced the ability to do lineage detection across dependencies for SQL objects, even like SQL stored procedures. That's all today for Purview. What's new for SQL Server 2022 is the last bullet point: set up and control access rights to SQL Server. All right, so let's pick on people that aren't on the call, like Buck Woody, my colleague. Let's say that Buck Woody, I would like to make him part of a new role I have in my organization for performance monitoring. Now, I don't want to give Buck sysadmin rights. I don't trust Buck enough to do that. But I want him to do performance administration type activities, which means I need to give him access to things like DMVs, things like that to monitor my SQL assets. But I don't want to have to connect to all my SQL assets to do it. I don't want to go in and write scripts to every SQL server, every Azure SQL database, managed instance to make this happen. I don't even want to maintain it. So Purview is going to allow you to set up a policy and publish this to your SQL assets. And then now I have a central way to set up access rights to SQL Server for certain operations. And part of our intention here is to make these new roles available that are for common scenarios to give you a more granular way of controlling permissions other than just blanket giving somebody complete sysadmin rights. Excited to see this technology land. We just announced this. We also announced public preview for this for Azure SQL Database, so you can go out there and see what it looks like in action for that service. Okay, that concludes kind of like the major things we're doing for what I would call Azure-enabled or cloud-connected SQL. I think you can see this is more powerful than anything we've provided before. But again, to remind you, this is not required of you to install SQL Server 2022. These are options for you as you install the release. Now, let me stop and answer one frequently asked question I get. How much is it going to cost? Like, how do I pay for all this stuff? What are the new licensing and additions for SQL Server 2022? We're not prepared to announce those. We don't really do that ever until we go generally available. One of the reasons we don't do that is we take feedback during the preview for some of these things, right? So when we go generally available for SQL Server 2022 next calendar year, we will come out and tell you, here are all the ways that licensing will work, how pricing works, how additions work, what features go with additions. So you can bet to see more of that as we come to the release when we announce it. Okay. Now, I told you the second part of the wheel of power was built-in query intelligence. What's the challenge? You have faced this challenge. Everybody here on this call today, and you listening and watching on demand on YouTube, have this challenge in mind. Query tuning is expensive and time-consuming. There are people that have entire industries based on this, and that's okay. But we want to continue to make the story better and less expensive and less time-consuming. So how are we going to do that? First of all, we're going to start leveraging more of the power of your query store. We believe in query store as a great technology. In fact, we believe the innovations we've made in query store in the cloud and in previous versions of SQL Server give us the ability to turn it on by default for new databases in SQL Server 2022. In addition, one of the most common requested features of query store is to support it for read replicas from availability groups. The data will be stored in the primary replica, but we will be able to harness and put metadata in query store to tell you, did this query come from a read replica or from a primary replica? So that'll be in the cloud and in SQL Server 2022. And then to give you a better experience than plan guides, we're going to let you do something called a query store hint to shape plans with no code changes. And in fact, we're going to take advantage of query store hints in some cases to light up new intelligent query processing scenarios. What is intelligent query processing? This is built-in functionality to the query processor in the engine with you making no code changes. In some cases, you just upgrade to SQL Server. In some cases, you do a new DB compat level and you light up new functionality without hitting a checkbox. You just say, hey, here's the new DB compat level. All of a sudden, I can get faster for certain scenarios. Now, why is an arrow tied between these? And why do I call it next generation? Well, first of all, there's an arrow tied between these because there are some new scenarios where we're going to tie in the query store to the functionality for IQP. Why is it called next generation? It's called next generation because it's the third generation of features we put into this functionality. Maybe it's a goal of mine someday that I don't even have to call out what intelligent query processing is because you just get better. But I think it's important for you to understand, why would I move to SQL 2022 to light up some things that might help me? Maybe these topics on this screen are things you run into. Maybe degree of parallelism causes you headache for your workloads. Maybe the new cardinality estimation model that we introduced in 2014 causes you problems. Maybe parameter sensitive plans are really, really a problem for you in your organization. We intend to try to solve the most common problems in those areas in SQL Server 2022. Let's talk a little bit more about the expansive list of things we're doing in intelligent query processing, though, across the board. Notice also it says here two things. At the top right-hand corner, cloud first, and gain performance with no code changes. So cloud first, because we often will do things in the cloud in Azure, then bring them to SQL Server. We're in a unique time here with SQL Server 2022, where I think you might see some of these things light up together. You might see a public preview of one of the things I'm going to talk about in this slide show up, and then all of a sudden, you're also going to see it in Azure SQL, or in SQL Server 2022 first, maybe it's announced, and then it's in public preview for Azure. The code base is the same. It's how we light them up when we decide to announce them as previews in the system. Why is it called gain performance with no code changes? And I've said this many times before, but I don't mind repeating it at all because I think I want you to resonate with your mind of what we're doing. We don't want you to have to do query hints anymore. We don't want you to have to do trace flags anymore. We don't have to change your code anymore just to get faster or get consistent performance. And I'm really being honest because I've seen the email threads and I've had the meetings. We don't just sit up in Redmond, well, or virtually, and just dream up stuff. We literally look at your feedback. We look at top customer cases, top field requests, top user voice requests, and say, what are the common pain points people run into with query processing? So let's look at the list. Let's say you decide you want to upgrade to SQL Server 2022. If you do that and you're using these DB compat levels, you get what you got before. So whatever we introduced in SQL 17 and 19, you just get that when you upgrade to SQL Server 2022. You don't lose that. But what do you get in addition just by doing the upgrade? Well, first of all, we're introducing approximate versions of these functions that are very common for you to use in big query scenarios, in analytic scenarios. We did this with distinct functions in SQL 19, and so we're lining them up for percentile functions in SQL 2022. If the query store is turned on, we'll light up two new features. Number one, if you have scenarios where planned cache eviction occurs on your system, and all of a sudden you get something what we call a compile storm. Everybody has to compile their queries at once. We can make that better for you. We will do something called persist a compile step for your query in the query store. And if we start compiling the query and determine it is the same compilation step we need, we'll just use that and go right into the cache. So compilation becomes much faster and it reduces a lot of CPU overhead when these compile storms occur. Second, and this has been something that has plagued people for many, many years. They're always trying to figure out how to touch degree of parallelism. What should the max DOP setting be for my server, my database, my instance, my query? So what we like to do is use the query store to look at your queries and build a feedback loop for specific queries and adjust the DOP for specific queries without recompiling them to create a smoother experience for your workload. One of the things I should mention here, any of these things I'm talking about can always be disabled. And we've done this in the past with the IQP scenarios per query and per database through alter database scope configuration. So if you see any of this stuff and go, well, I don't even want that one, so I don't want to upgrade to SQL 2022 and you touch DOP, no problem. You can turn that off for your database and we won't do it. But if you want the full experience, you just let us try to handle this with the feedback loop and see if it helps your workload. Second of all, let's say that you are on one of these two compat levels. Because one of the things that's not obvious here maybe is that what if you're on DB compat level like 130? I'm on an older one from 2016 and upgrade to SQL 2022. You still get the things on the left-hand side of the screen here. But if you are on DB compat 140 or greater, including 140, 150, and the new one called 160, which I'll talk about in a second, we are going to improve the memory grant feedback process, which we introduced in SQL 17. We've got a better algorithm to make this a better experience. This is what we've learned from you. And what's most importantly, we'll persist the feedback mechanism in the query store so that even if cache eviction occurs, we don't have to redo this process all over again. This is us listening to you and making the experience better. What if I do go to the new DB compat level, which we're introducing with SQL 2022, and it'll also be in the cloud? We are going to try to save the world from parameter sniffing. And I've got a nice demonstration to show you what I mean by that in a second. Second of all, if the query store is enabled, we will give you a better experience for cardinality estimation. So regardless of your cardinal estimation setting, legacy model, not legacy model, if we make choices based on this new CE model that we've built in 2014, we will create a feedback loop and adjust and use query store hints to see if we can actually make the situation better for you. This is a daunting list of things we're doing in the release. This is the most aggressive set of new features we're doing. So I'm pretty excited to see how this is going to land for you. We're already starting to get feedback in the private preview. And so what I'd like to do, though, is focus on one specific one that I have seen to be a common problem for years for many customers. And that's called parameter sensitive plans. Okay, let's pick on some other people in the organization that are not on the call. We always get to do that when they're on the call, right? So Pedro Lopes, my colleague, comes in and runs a stored procedure called myproc, and it has passed a value of 1 as a parameter. in that stored procedure is a query that uses that parameter value to run a query against a table, like a where clause. Well, it turns out that where clause only goes after a couple of rows. So an index seek plan is perfectly legitimate for a page rows query. He's very happy, it runs very quickly. Now, Pam LaHood, another one of my great colleagues, aka at SQL Goddess, she comes in and runs her stored procedure. It's the same stored procedure and has a parameter value of 10. Well, what's happened in the meantime is the plan that was in cache for the seek got evicted for memory pressure, unknown reasons. So because Pam's parameter goes after a lot of rows, the best plan for Pam is a scan. Now here's the problem. There's only one version of a plan in cache for a stored procedure or parameterized statement at a time. So what happens if Pedro comes back and runs this query again? He runs it. Look at the red. In fact, that's the color of Pedro's face because his procedure now runs very slow because a scan is not optimal for his query execution. In fact, he sees a degradation in performance, not happy person. So that is the before scenario. If in SQL Server 2022, you go to the latest DB compat level with no code changes, here's what happens. Pedro runs his query, gets the index seek. Let's say plan cache eviction happens again. Pan comes in and runs her query, a scan occurs. Pedro runs again. Without Pedro's knowledge, the optimizer looks at his scenario and looks at statistics and says, you know what, a seek is a better plan than that scan in cache. I'm going to fork it, and I'm going to create a new plan in cache for the same stored procedure. Now, both users are happy, both get fast performance, both get consistent performance, no code changes required. Beautiful. Let's go look at a demonstration, and let's do something very dangerous. Let's go do a live demonstration. Oh my, Bob, what is your live demonstration going to look like? It looks like this. Okay. So over here, I've got a database. It's a property agent listing database. And I've got a table to list agents and their real estate listings. And what you see here is a similar scenario as I just saw. I got a stored procedure. The parameter value of 8, an index seek is best for that plan, okay? With a parameter value of 2 over here, if I simulate plan cache eviction, clear the cache, and run the procedure with a 2, an index scan is best for that plan. These two things can exist at the same time today with previous versions of SQL Server. So let's see what it looks like in action. I'm going to use the popular tool ostress to run these workloads. So I'm just going to go run ostress with a bunch of users with that first parameter. I should get a seek. I'm going to clear the plan cache to simulate plan cache eviction, run a 2, and see what a scan looks like. So let's go kick these off and look at the behavior. So I'm going to run this, and I'm going to go in perfmon to see the behavior. Now what I'm going to see here is processor time and batch requests per second. Processor time is reasonable. Batch requests per second is really healthy for me in this case. So I have high processor time, but not pegged. And it's very quick. In fact, if I go back here and see the query, I can see it only runs in like 4 seconds. What if I run the scan? This is simulating the problem in the slide. Run the scan. It takes a few seconds. Again, I'm simulating plan cache eviction, but now I'm running Pam's query. And so a scan is being used for it. Now at this time, if I go back and run the seek, it's going to use the scan. And if you look at perfmon, what does it look like? This is really bad. This is really bad. This is, if you look here, this is hot. Look at this batch request per second goes way down here. And processor time goes almost to 100% pegged. This is because Pedro's query is running over and over and over with a very poor plan. He sees a performance degradation so bad that I got to cancel this thing. So what are you going to do? Well, today, it is a very, very laborious process to get around this problem. People constantly chasing their tail to solve it. Let's go solve it with SQL Server 2022 by doing this. Let's go change the DB compat level to 160. And let's clear our plan cache. I'm going to clear query store because I'm going to show you the after effects of this. I'm going to go run the same scenarios I did before. So come here, run my seek. It's going to take about the same time as before. I'm simulating and I'm showing you what I showed you on the slide. 4 seconds or so, run the scan. And then I'm going to come back and run the seek again. And what I hope to be is to get to see the same or similar or faster performance than I did before with the seek. And if I go into perfmon, I see exactly that. Here is, right here, Here's execution for that one I just ran. And look over here. Here is the same execution using 160. So you can see these are the same now. And in fact, if you go back over here, can you see it's about the same performance? Now, I told you there's multiple plans in cache. I'm going to prove it to you by looking at the query store. So I'm going to kick over here. I'm going to see that I have 2 plans, same query. There's something that we've adjusted or used to make this happen called a query variant, which is why you see this option here in the query store. Now you're saying to yourself, well, Bob, that's 2 queries, you're cheating. I'll prove that we're not. I'll go to the DMVs and show you that we're not. So if you go over here, I'll go to the query store DMVs. And sure enough, if you look at the text in query store, it does look like there are 2 queries. But if you go look at the query store query DMV, you can see that these hash to the same query value. So even though we're using this query variant concept and it looks at from a text perspective in the query store we're actually not. So what have I done? I've introduced a DB compat level 160 and I solve parameter sensitive plan problem for these store procedures, 2 different plans, same procedure. Now, I've had a lot of questions about this. It doesn't require the query store to be enabled. I just use the query store to show the behavior. And we don't bloat the cache. We're going to be smart about this. We're only going to pick the right number of plans we need to support the different types of query patterns that are best suited to those plans. So we're not going to overload your cache with thousands of plans because of this. We'll really be smart about how we do this. This could be one of the #1 features we're introducing for SQL Server 2022. I'm very, very excited to see how this is going to play out. All right, let's go back to our demonstration, but let's stop and see, Kevin, if we've got any major questions about this or anything else that's big.
Yep, major question. I'm sure it's on the mind of most people here. Are these features that you're talking about so far available as standard edition, or has that been decided yet?
Yeah, great question. And Kevin, it's okay. I understand people are anxious to know that, and I get that every time we release SQL Server. So I'll give you the answer that I always give, and that is we don't announce which features go with which editions until we make the product generally available. We do seek feedback during the preview program. So during preview, and even we have public preview, we'll seek everyone's feedback about which features should go with which edition. You've seen in the past what we've tried to establish starting in SQL 16 is to make sure the surface area as a programmer is consistent across editions. But as far as all these functionalities and features, we don't make those announcements until we make the product generally available.
Awesome. Okay. Can you use, or I'm sure you're going to do a demo on Purview, but
I will not be doing Purview today, but you'll see more of that. We'll definitely see more of that as we move along in the release.
Okay, then I'll keep this.
But I can answer the Purview question. Go ahead. What's going on Purview?
Okay. Can you use Purview to restrict the privacy for specific columns for PII?
So the question is that we're restricting columns access. We haven't really, elaborated on all the details of what access rights Purview will do. Right now, the biggest thing we're focusing on is like this overall role concept. But we are spending more cycles also in SQL Server 2022 on the whole granularity of permission rights. So that'll be something we'll have to go take a look at as we move through the release. It's good feedback.
Awesome. That's all the questions we have so far then.
Okay. So we got about 17 minutes left, and I've covered for you so far, excuse me, let me go back here. I've covered you so far 2 huge major areas of SQL 2022, which is why I covered them first. I spent a lot of time on them. Cloud connectivity, built-in query intelligence. But again, I told you that the meat and potatoes of SQL Server were the engine. Security, performance and scalability, and availability. Let me just talk about a couple of these. And then there's so much more to cover here. This is where we'll go deeper in the next calendar year. But let me just highlight a couple that you want to know about. Let's talk about SQL Server Ledger. I'm gonna mention that in a second and show you a slide about how powerful that can be. We're going to improve further the TempDB story. We're going to continue to make system page latching a better story. David Pless has got some really cool demos he's built to show this off. We're trying to make TempDB hands-free from a latch perspective, and we've got some more work that we've done here in this release. And then you might find a couple of things interesting on this side. We're improving the whole multi-write replication scenario. We're announcing the ability to do snapshot backups using T-SQL to freeze I/O, so you don't have to rely on the volume snapshot service. And we partnered with Intel. This is an interesting one, using their Quick Assist hardware technology to make compression better, faster, and less overhead on your workload. Let's talk about Ledger. Sorry, there's a couple other things I forgot. I had this on my deck here because I don't want to miss a few things. Like the fact I even mentioned about new granular permissions and roles, about crypto enhancements, about even improving TLS for connection encryptions for SQL Server. XML compression, finally, that's one that people have asked about a lot. And you see these other ones here. Look at parallel redo enhancements. We've had limitations on how parallel redo will work on a number of databases. Now we're just opening up the pipe. And we're allowing parallel redo to occur on any database when we run SQL Server for recovery. So you're going to see so much more in this space as we move through the release. I think I just need to build, and David did a presentation of this at PASS. We probably need to have him back to your group just to go over all this stuff that are on these checkboxes here, because there's even more that I'm listing on the screen right here. Let's talk about a couple of them, like Ledger. One of the challenges customers have asked us is, hey, I like temporal tables. I like taking SQL Server to track information, but I need tamper evidence of this. In other words, I want to prevent Bob Ward from going in and hacking my SQL Server to make it look like somebody else did changes, or covering the tracks of changes he made from an audit perspective. So you may have heard of a technology called blockchain. Blockchain can do these kind of things to give you tamper evidence, tamper proof. But the problem with blockchain is that it's typically in decentralized systems. So people say, I'd like to have the power of blockchain in a system like SQL Server. Let's take a look at it. Let's say in this bank system, there's a table that we want to track things for ledger information, like records and transactions. So we can go in T-SQL and call this a ledger table. Now, let's say that Bob Ward got access as a DBA to the system. You didn't mean to give him access, or maybe he's a rogue DBA. And he goes in and makes a change, like increases somebody's account by $50,000. Well, because you made it a ledger table, there's a record of that. There's a history table and a view that somebody made a change to increase this transaction by $50,000. Now, let's say that Bob is pretty clever once you show this to him and says, okay, cool. I'm a pretty smart guy. I know how to go in and I know how to go hack pages. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to go hack the pages of these table without using T-SQL to make it look like I increased the transaction or the account by $50,000. And your little ledger system won't track me from T-SQL. Well, guess what? Inside SQL Server is a ledger, is a blockchain. There are hashed versions of this data. So we can go in and compare the system tables with these hash values with the SQL tables and see that they're off. Now, we can't tell exactly that Bob did this, but we know they're off. And we might have other things in the system, though, to track when it happened. So let's say Bob is even further clever. He's like, okay, I'm a pretty smart guy. I'm a SQL Server internals expert. I know how to hack not just those pages, those tables. I know how to get access to system tables. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to hack your hash and the tables so it looks like it all looks the same. Well, it turns out in Ledger, I can keep what's called a digest in a separate trusted storage facility. It's part of the Ledger system, which is like a checksum to the blocks. Now, an auditor, a regulator can come in and say, whoops, there's a problem. The hashes or the digest you have in your trusted storage facility, they don't match what's in the ledger. Now I've got a tamper evidence track record of changes, and I'm even protecting myself from malicious actors who think they know how to go into SQL Server and hack stuff. That's the promise of SQL Server Ledger. It's built into T-SQL, and it's already in public preview for Azure SQL today. Very excited to see many different industries go take advantage, not just like banks, but you name an industry that needs to have a tamper evidence track record of changes in their system, we provide that. We also even provide an append-only ledger scenario if you want to use that for auditing purposes. Okay, I mentioned another capability was replication. Now today, with peer-to-peer replication, we do provide the ability to have the same database sharded across two servers, and you make changes at the same time into these two copies of the database. But I need an automatic and logical conflict detection for this, because that's not how it works today. In fact, if you consider this scenario right here, if somebody comes in and updates a row and sets this value at time 0, and then at time 1, somebody tries to change that same row with a different value, in the current system, that's a conflict. And when it does, it halts replication. Now, if you try to go resolve this manually, the problem is the only way to do that is to get like the highest replica ID. Well, that's not even logical. So with SQL Server 2022, we're going to make this automatic and more logical. In other words, if we detect this problem and you turn on this automatic detection conflict resolution, we will automatically resolve it, and we'll say the last writer wins based on UTC times across these systems. This is more logical. The last person to make the change probably is the one that should win here, and I can see that I have like record of that this conflict actually occurred, and it's all automatic. Turns out we released this functionality in SQL 19 in a recent cumulative update, so you even have it there, but we'll make this even better in SQL Server 2022. So this is a way for us to support multi-write replication, multi-write scenarios. Okay, we talked about the engine. We talked about ledger. We talked about replication. I mentioned about TempDB latching getting better. A lot more to uncover there, as you'll see in the future. The last two areas of the wheel of power was data virtualization and object storage and T-SQL. Let's talk about those. So Polybase is a functionality we introduced in SQL 16 and 19. But what people have told us is that customers have mentioned, we've seen in the industry, is that there's some other types of systems that have come up that I'd like to get access to, and I don't want to have to move data to do it. So in SQL 2022, we'll introduce new functionality for Polybase using REST APIs. We'll still use the same open roast and external table concept as you did before, but we'll natively understand Parquet and JSON and Delta formats if you tell us that's the format of the data. And then notice down here, we'll support Azure Blob Storage still in Azure Data Lake, but we'll now support S3. And in fact, we're going to go further. If you want to take backups of your SQL databases and restore them, today you can use disk or you can use URL for Azure Blob Storage. We will now support, using REST APIs, S3 compatible object storage systems. Look at all the different choices you have today, and there are many more. So for example, you've decided that MinIO is a great object storage provider for your company, and you store all sorts of different things there today in your system. It's all S3 compatible. That's a protocol that Amazon started and now is popular in the industry for object storage. You can natively now do a backup to S3 to MinIO and then restore it back to SQL Server. So it's a way for us to give you access and use other object storage systems, could be in the cloud, could be in your data center, wherever these things reside, not only query data that is unstructured, but of known formats, and join it with SQL Server data without moving the data, but also do things like backup restore of SQL data to other storage systems other than what we provided in the past. So that's data lake virtualization and object storage coming to SQL Server 2022. And then finally, I mentioned about T-SQL. I always get this comment from customers. T-SQL is a skill I have grown for years. If I'm forced to learn the new languages, I'm out of a job. Or I'm constantly fighting myself to learn new stuff. Don't make me learn new things, new languages to learn new things. So I don't want to learn new languages to get new features, just extend T-SQL. And I think we got a pretty good track record of this. So we're trying to even go further here. So number one, we know people want to manipulate JSON data in new and exciting ways. So we're going to improve the JSON function experience with T-SQL to query manipulate JSON data in SQL Server. This is an interesting one. This is a Connor Cunningham special. Connor has a great experience with T-SQL. So he has a team of people that are closing language gaps, things like Windows functions and string functions, things that we've seen from customer feedback and ANSI compatibility. Look for more in this space coming in the future, but we're trying to go close some gaps that we have in our T-SQL language based on your feedback and based on what we've seen from the industry and ANSI. In Azure SQL Edge, we introduced the concept of time series data. You having data that's naturally processed as time series, you want to use T-SQL functions to go process and look at that data. We're going to bring all of those time series functions into the SQL Server engine. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There are more things coming. But again, anything we're doing for new features for SQL Server, we want to leverage the power of the T-SQL language to do that. Okay. I mentioned to you today that we've enabled Azure with SQL Server on your terms for disaster recovery, analytics, security in new and innovative ways. We are investing heavily in built-in query intelligence. We want you to spend less time tuning, more time getting faster, and certainly we don't want you to have to make code changes to get all of that. We have new innovations for security, scalability, and availability. A lot more to hear about that in the future, but I mentioned Ledger and multi-write replications, two of those. And I showed you the power of new data virtualization capabilities with S3 connectors, Parquet, Delta formats, JSON types, and the new object storage capabilities. A lot of our partners are excited to see that come to play. And then I talked about briefly about extending the T-SQL language to make things better and light up new developer scenarios. You're sitting back going, Bob, great overview, great introduction. Where's more? Lots more. I'm going to leave this slide up as we end today's presentation. I take more questions. Here's the main website. As we innovate in this release in the next calendar year, stay in touch with that top link right there. This is where we're putting all the central information about SQL Server 2022. You may have watched today and said, you know what? I think I qualify for this private preview. I want to sign up and work with the team directly. So there's the link to sign up for the early adopter program. Well, I saw that Synapse link thing that Bob talked about, but I want to see it in action. The SQL, the Microsoft Mechanics team are the coolest people in the world. And I really had a great time building a mechanics video with them. So go take a look at my Microsoft Mechanics deep dive with them, including a demonstration on Synapse link. And then register for our webinar. We did a webinar that we broadcast live in November, and it's available on demand. Myself, Marketing Lead Matthew Burrows, Anna Hoffman are all on the show. We talk about more of these capabilities. You can see me in action on a camera, I guess, if you want to see that, talk about these features. And then there is no better way to keep track of what's going on in the world of Azure data than Data Exposed. There's this rock star person named Anna Hoffman, who's one of the smartest people I know, and also one of the most brilliant people I know to come up with this idea. This idea is like a television show. She brings on all of these amazing people, both in Microsoft and outside of Microsoft, to give you the latest news on Azure SQL and Azure Data. And we've got a new series that we've started on Data Exposed for SQL Server 2022. And you can go out there and see some of those now already. Myself, Pedro Lopes, and in the future, you're going to see other folks from our organization as part of the show. So, that one alone is worth gold because it's just a way for you on a Channel 9 YouTube channel for you to just keep up track what's going on with our technology. I really appreciate you joining today, taking time out of your workday to listen to what we have to say about SQL Server 2022. I hope that I achieved the goal of a couple of things. Making you think about whether this is a release that you can plan for the next calendar year or something that you want to take a look at. Keep you excited about SQL Server. SQL Server is not going away. Still a great technology. We believe it's an industry-proven technology, but we're creating some new innovations like enabling with Azure in new ways because we know customers have told us that they want to be in both places. I want to be in the cloud and I want to also be in SQL Server still. So how do I tie these things together? So with these last 3 minutes left in our presentation today, let's see if we have any questions we need to tie up from the audience, Kevin.
There are actually no more questions coming in so far. I want to remind everyone to actually, if you have any questions, let's put them out there quickly because the presentation is running short on time. But everyone remember that we are going to record this. Session is being recorded and it will be available here rather soon, probably within the next couple of days. We do have one question on XML. Besides compression, is there anything that is actually changing or updating on the new version of SQL Server 22?
Nothing to announce at this time for XML besides compression, but stay tuned. We still got a ways to go in the release, so there could be other things in that space that will be coming.
Awesome.
Kevin, I saw a couple of questions I just saw pop up here. So Ree, maybe you can post this in there. There's a link that I don't have in here. I wish I'd added this called aka.ms SQL Server 2022 Decks. aka.ms SQL Server 2022 Decks. Those are PDF versions of the slides of my presentation and other deep dives we did at PASS. They're PDFs because it's private preview. So we can't really release all the actual PowerPoint slides, but you'll go there because you're going to get more information than even what I showed here today. And then I saw some other questions again about like, where can I download it? How do I get access? Remember, in private preview. So public preview and general availability will be coming next year. And that's when the general public will be able to download the release. Thank you, Ree, for all the great postings you did. Ree's amazing. She's listening in and posting like 7 million posts while she's watching the presentation.
As always, Ree is awesome.
As always, yeah. She is a Falcons fan, though. That's a problem.
Rise up.
Is the new query store going to be available on each database in SQL Server 22? I expect so.
Yeah, so what we'll do is, in the preview, we're going to see how this works out, right? When you create a new database in SQL 2022, we'll light up the query store by default. If you upgrade a previous release database and query store is not on, we will not turn it on. That's kind of keeping a long-standing tradition of not changing something on an upgrade. If it was on, we'll just keep it on. But if you create a brand new database, we'll turn it on by default.
Awesome. Well, that looks like the end of the questions. So I do appreciate you, Bob.
Oh, thanks for having me. I
Honestly,
really appreciate you having me on your show and your group. I love what the work y'all do. I think I've been doing this fundamentals virtual group for a while now, even before we were doing virtual. So it's a great way to people to get access to information. And I look forward to seeing it broadcast on demand for folks here in a few days.
Me and you both. All right. So with that, I do want to thank everyone for coming, and do remind you to come to our next presentation, which will be yet again with Bob. And this is next year in the middle of January 16th. So with that, I do thank everyone for coming. Do appreciate y'all, and we'll talk to you next time.
Take care, everybody.